Before we begin, I need you to do something for me. Dim those lights. Yes, I'm serious. Turn off those harsh fluorescent bulbs if you've got them. Maybe light a candle if one's within reach. Pour yourself something special into your favorite cup. We're about to step into a century so chaotic, so utterly absurd, so drenched in wine and blood, that your mind might struggle to believe any of it actually happened. But every word of what I'm about to tell you is true. Welcome to the first 100 years of what we call the Common Era. Or, if you prefer the traditional way of marking time, the years 0 to 100, Anno Domini. But here's the thing that will make your head spin right from the start. There never was a year 0. That's right. That smooth transition you might imagine between before Christ and Anno Domini. That elegant pivot point where history turns from counting backward to counting forward. It never existed. Our calendar system jumps straight from 1 year before Christ to 1 year Anno Domini, like someone stumbling over a step they forgot was there. One moment you're counting down toward what should be the most important moment in human history, and the next moment you're counting up again, blinking in confusion and hoping nobody noticed the awkward leap. The historians who created our dating system didn't make an error. They made a deliberate choice. A strange, mathematics-defying, thoroughly medieval choice. You can blame a monk named Dionysius Exiguus for this oddity. Yes, that really was his name. And no, despite how it sounds, he wasn't some kind of ancient wizard. He was a 6th century monk who had a talent for working with dates, and apparently no patience whatsoever for the concept of 0 as a number, and that bizarre beginning. It perfectly captures the spirit of what's coming. Because the 1st century Anno Domini was nothing short of a chaotic masterpiece. This was a 100-year span when emperors hoarded power like dragons, guarding treasure when volcanoes turned thriving cities into scenes that looked like someone had dumped the contents of a giant ashtray across the landscape, and when the average Roman citizen was unknowingly adding deadly neurotoxins to their wine, because they thought it improved the flavor. So get comfortable, because we're about to walk through a century that began with a mathematical lie and ended with enough architectural brilliance, philosophical upheaval, and medical confusion to make your head spin faster than a gladiator tumbling from his chariot. Let's begin at the very pinnacle of Roman society. The emperor himself. Or more precisely, the first true emperor, Augustus. Augustus didn't simply wake up one morning and announce his intention to rule the world. He played what we might call the ultimate long game. Within about 20 years, he had clawed, schemed, and fought his way to absolute power, which in ancient Rome was essentially the political equivalent of being the last person standing after a knife fight broke out at a dinner party. And Roman politics was basically one continuous series of dinner parties, where everyone brought knives. Augustus was clever about how he presented his new role. He didn't declare himself emperor outright, because that would have seemed crude and obvious. Instead, he took the title princeps, meaning the first citizen. This was essentially code for saying, yes, I'm completely in charge of everything, but let's all pretend we're still equals here, shall we? What followed became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This was roughly 2 centuries of relative stability throughout the empire. Though your opinion of how peaceful it actually was might depend on how you feel about widespread slavery, public crucifixions, and the occasional complete imperial mental breakdown. Rome had suddenly transformed itself into an empire with an extraordinary talent for marble columns, roads that ran straight as arrows across impossible terrain, and an eagle large enough to pave half the known world. Augustus played his role with careful restraint. He centralized governmental power, invested heavily in infrastructure projects, and commissioned countless statues of himself looking thoughtful and heroic. It was essentially propaganda before anyone had invented social media. But Rome wasn't all soaring aqueducts and stoic philosophers contemplating the nature of existence. Rome had some very serious problems. Let's talk about the wine, because this is where things get truly disturbing. Wine was everywhere in Roman society. It flowed as freely as blood at a Caesar family gathering. And the wealthier you were, the sweeter you preferred your wine to taste. Which brings us to a substance called lead acetate. The Romans had a special name for it. It was a syrupy, artificially sweetened wine additive that made your vintage taste like fermented candy. It was absolutely delicious. It was also absolutely deadly. You see, the Romans had developed what they considered a brilliant technique for improving their wine. They would boil their grape must in pots made of lead. Over time, they noticed that wine prepared this way tasted significantly better. What they didn't notice, or perhaps didn't care to think about too deeply, was that the process was infusing their wine with lead. Lead, the same substance that makes your brain gradually forget how to function as a brain. The symptoms of lead poisoning include hallucinations, paralysis, infertility, and complete madness. But if the emperor was drinking lead-sweetened wine, then everyone who could afford it was probably drinking it too. So they raised their cups and toasted their health while slowly poisoning themselves. By around 30 Anno Domini, while wealthy patricians were unknowingly marinating their brains in leadless wine, something completely different was happening in a dusty, politically occupied corner of the empire. In Judea, a local preacher was causing the kind of trouble that made Roman administrators very nervous. Jesus of Nazareth wasn't wealthy, wasn't politically connected, and probably wouldn't have been allowed into the Roman Senate, even if he had somehow invented a way to build aqueducts out of fish. But his message of radical love, defiance of imperial power, and turning the other cheek in a world where that other cheek usually got stabbed, began to spread among the people. Rome was famous for not tolerating uprisings of any kind. So they crucified him. Problem solved, right? Completely wrong. Christianity didn't disappear after the crucifixion. Instead, it multiplied, slowly and quietly, through underground burial chambers and whispered gospel stories. This countercultural fire began spreading across the empire. In the beginning, most Romans saw it as nothing more than a weird, marginal cult. But by the end of the 1st century, Christian communities had followers in every major Roman city. They discovered that you can't kill an idea by killing the person who first spoke it. Let's shift our attention to entertainment, because Roman entertainment deserves its own chapter in the story of human spectacle. When you think of Roman entertainment, you probably pictured the Colosseum, that massive, looming, dramatically imposing structure where men fought lions and history was literally rewritten in blood. Construction began around 70 Anno Domini under Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian was a practical, no-nonsense kind of ruler. Think of him as that grumpy uncle everyone has, except this particular uncle happened to rule the known world and had developed a serious passion for ambitious construction projects. The Colosseum wasn't built just for games and spectacles. It was a monument to imperial control. It was Rome's way of saying to its citizens, "Look at this incredible engineering. Look at these exotic lions. Now please stop thinking so much about your taxes." The structure could hold up to 50,000 people. That represents an enormous number of togas, tunics, and concentrated body odor. Spectators were seated according to strict social hierarchy, with senators enjoying marble seats close to the action while the poor squinted at the proceedings from the distant upper levels. Are you still enjoying whatever you poured into that cup? Around the same time the Colosseum was rising in Rome, far to the east, a desperate rebellion was erupting that would change Jewish history forever. The Jewish revolt began in 66 Anno Domini. Jewish rebels, finally fed up with Roman taxation, cultural oppression, and being treated like second-class residents in their own ancestral land, rose up against imperial rule. At first, their rebellion actually succeeded. They managed to hold Jerusalem, and hope surged through Jewish communities. Rome did not react kindly to hope, especially hope that involved defying Roman authority. By 70 Anno Domini, Roman legions had stormed Jerusalem, completely destroyed the Second Temple, which was the spiritual and cultural heart of Judaism, and systematically razed much of the city. The destruction was brutal, deliberate, and absolutely total. This marked the beginning of what became known as the Jewish diaspora. Jewish survivors either fled or were forcibly exiled, scattering across the Roman Empire and beyond. They carried their traditions, their stories, and their collective grief with them wherever they went. Let's take a brief detour to the city of Alexandria, because not everything happening in the first century involved war, wine, or religious upheaval. Some of it was pure science fiction made real. There is a man named Hero of Alexandria. Think of him as the Steve Jobs of steam-powered technology. This remarkable inventor, working in the 60s, Anno Domini, created an early form of automated theater. He used steam pressure, pulleys, and mechanical systems to create special effects that could simulate thunder and lightning on stage. He even built a device that created what we would recognize as stereo sound. In a world that wouldn't see anything like Spotify for nearly 2,000 years, Hero made echoes bounce across theatrical stages like ghostly applause. The effect was eerie, magical, and centuries ahead of anything else being created at the time. And then, like so many brilliant innovations throughout history, it simply disappeared. The empire moved on to other concerns. Wars got in the way. It would take another 1800 years before anyone would create anything remotely similar. Now, take a deep breath and hold it, because in 17 Anno Domini, the earth itself coughed. Mount Vesuvius erupted. Vesuvius buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under massive waves of volcanic ash and debris. People died in mid-step, frozen forever in whatever they were doing when the mountain exploded. Dogs were preserved in their final desperate stretches toward safety. Loaves of bread were carbonized while still sitting in bakery ovens. The eruption was absolutely horrifying. And yet, in a strange way, it was also beautiful. Because that same ash that killed everything also preserved everything. Graffiti on walls, intricate floor, mosaics, prepared food, elaborate bathhouses, even brothels with their decorative paintings still intact. You can walk through the streets of Pompeii today and feel the presence of that lost world pressing against your consciousness like the memory of a dream. It's the closest thing to actual time travel you can experience, except with significantly more hardened lava. And speaking of preserved wonders from the ancient world, sometime around 65 Anno Domini, a ship sank off the coast of an island called Inside that shipwreck was a device that simply should not have existed. The Antikythera mechanism was a complex astronomical computer constructed entirely from bronze gears. It could predict lunar cycles, solar eclipses, and even calculate the dates when the Olympic Games would be held. This was Greek engineering preserved in Roman wreckage, and it completely defies everything we thought ancient technology was capable of achieving. This wasn't just a calculator. It was like finding a whisper from some vanished genius, speaking across centuries. And for more than 1,000 years after it was created, no one anywhere in the world could build anything even remotely similar. Finally, let me tell you about a man named Scribonius, because yes, dentistry actually existed in ancient Rome. Largus served as the personal physician to Emperor Nero. He used gold for dental crowns. He cauterized infected nerves. He approached tooth pain like it was some kind of divine prophecy that needed careful interpretation. His treatments were primitive by our standards, certainly, but they actually worked, at least sometimes. Of course, it probably helped that at least your teeth weren't falling out from lead poisoning. Oh, wait. Actually, they were. So what are we supposed to make of this extraordinary century that began with a missing zero and was fueled entirely by human ambition? It was a time of simultaneous invention and destruction, of marble beauty and bloody spectacle, of voices that rose from dust and poverty and refused to die, even when the most powerful empire in history tried to crush them completely. The Romans believed they would live forever. They built colosseums that could hold 50,000 people, created calendar systems, constructed roads that stretched toward horizons that seemed infinite. And yet some of their most lasting legacies were complete accidents. A city buried by volcanic ash, a poisoned wine cup, a crucified preacher whose followers refused to stay quiet. History isn't a straight line connecting past to future. It's more like a broken clay pot full of contradictions, echoes, and the remnants of things that were never supposed to survive. And as always, it leaves us with uncomfortable questions. Like this one. What might our own version of Sapa be? What are we consuming today, thinking it's harmless or even beneficial, that future people will look back on with horror? Thank you for taking this journey with me through the beautiful mess of the first century. If this kind of historical chaos fascinates you the way it fascinates me, you know what to do. Share it with that friend who always orders wine with Roman-sounding names at restaurants. And maybe, just maybe, take a moment to wonder what our own ruins will say about us when future archaeologists dig through what we've left behind. Or, as the Romans never actually said, because they didn't have a concept of zero out.